Hello everyone, my name is Porag. I'm from Bangladesh and welcome to Climate Action Figures.
Well, hello and welcome to another edition of Climate Action Figures. My name is John Whidden, and I am very excited again this week to be bringing you a young person who has just been at COP29. So, in a moment, you will meet Porag, and he will tell us all about that experience. But first, this week's Quick Fix, which comes to us from Lisa in Calgary. Lisa says shoveling snow onto the front lawn, and especially farther back onto the lawn, allows it to absorb water. Double benefit of providing more water to the lawn and groundwater instead of going down the storm drain, and avoiding the freeze thaw on your sidewalk that leads to so much ice. So, thank you very much to Lisa for sending that in. And welcome, Porag. What do you think about that quick fix?
Oh, first of all, I'm very we don't experience snow because it's
Right.
already as cold as it is. So snow would be devastating for us. But on a serious note, I think that's a very good thing to do. And this example, also shows us that yeah, nature does provide. We don't need to create extra facilities to water our lawns or to water our gardens. Nature provides that if we use the resources wisely.
Have you ever seen snow? Have you experienced snow?
Unfortunately, or I'll also call it fortunately, not yet. But I want to. I want to experience snow for at least once in my life.
Yes. Well, I just finished shoveling snow for about a half an hour. So hopefully you don't have to experience too much snow. Porag, we're very excited to have you on the program today. You were just at COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Can you tell us a little bit about what that experience was like for you?
I'll be very honest with you. Given the purpose of COP29, I must say I was super exhausted, and the outcome made me quite a bit sad.
We heard some similar things from one of the delegates from Thailand, Tanvi, who was on last week, and she talked about being hungry all the time. Was it the same for you?
Oh yeah. So this is one fundamental issue of cops is that the food in the venue is always overpriced, super expensive, and we don't have that kind of money. I cannot afford to buy a burger with 25 euros on a daily basis, right? 25
Wow.
euros is a lot of money in my country. So yeah, always super expensive food, super expensive drinks. All the foods
Right.
were expensive, and it felt like they were deliberately making the food expensive so that we stay hungry
Oh,
and we
interesting.
can't focus on the things that we plan to do. So yeah, I also completely agree with Tanvi that food was super expensive and I was always hungry.
So, how did you deal with that? You had to feed yourself somehow.
So what I did is I had a big breakfast in the morning outside the venue in my Airbnb where I stayed. And then I carried snacks and dry foods like biscuits, cookies, and other stuff that I could carry in my bag. And whenever I got a bit hungry, I used to eat a couple of cookies or maybe eat a small piece of cake and drink a lot of water. So, yeah, that's how I got through the daily hunger.
Now, we'll get to your feelings about the results from the conference in a few minutes. But aside from that, was it inspiring to be there amongst all these people who are focused on one thing that is obviously important to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was my third COP, and I must say each COP inspires me more in terms of the people who attend COP because the climate movement is very big and it's global, right? So we don't get to meet each other on a regular basis. COP might be the only platform that allows us to meet each other and to connect with each other on a physical level and to get together to push for our common climate goals. So yeah,
Would you like to give us an example of an interesting person you met this time?
this time I met some friends from UNDP. So I also work with UNFCCC's official Children and Youth Constituency, which is known as the Yango. So from that, from Yango, we've been working closely with a couple of people from UNDP for the past couple of years, but unfortunately, I could never meet them. So this was the COP when I first got to meet them, and UNDP. How what's the right? I'd use the word diplomatic space, right? So
Tell us what UNDP is.
UNDP is United Nations Development Program. It's a UN body, and they're supposed to be diplomatic. So you don't really get to know how they are as a person. So I met with them in person this year, and they're very good people, very funny, very jolly, very light-minded people, and I really liked meeting them and really like getting to know them on a personal level.
Porag, I'm curious to know about the balance between young men and young women. I've read studies recently that show that young women in Canada are more concerned about climate change than young men. I'm curious to know if there were fairly equal representation from young women and young men there.
No, this has never been a case where there were equal representations from young men and young women, because young men were in the majority. The number of young women attending COP is always less than men, because this might be a social issue, but the number of young women representing their countries, or maybe their organizations, or maybe their visions, have always been very less than young men at COPs. But one good thing about this COP is the number of young women at COP is increasing with every COP.
Let me take that to your country level for a moment. Do you feel like in Bangladesh that young women are affected more on an emotional or mental health level by climate change?
Yeah, as you may know that Bangladesh is severely hit by climate change, right? I mean, we are one of the most vulnerable countries. But when you dive deep and look in the spectrum, women, especially young women, are always hit harder than men, because in our country, some of the major climate issues are flooding and water salinity, right? I mean, salinity intrusion. There are reports that say that Bangladesh is one of the countries where the rate of child marriage is higher than its counterparts, or it might be the highest in the whole world. And climate change plays a very big role in that, because what happens in our country is we are not a very rich country, and most of the people in our country earn their bread and butter on a daily basis. So what happens is whenever a family is hit by a climate induced disaster, the girl of that family is always married off, most of the times married off, because when a family is hit and they don't have any livelihood, the parents tend to marry their daughter off so that they don't have to bear her expenses anymore. So this is a mental issue and an emotional issue. You just imagine a 15-year-old girl getting married just because they lost their home due to a flood. And also, in almost all the cases in the climate vulnerable areas, whenever there is a climate disaster happening, right after the disaster, most of the girls of that area are dropped off from school or from their educational institutions, just because the parents cannot afford to educate them anymore. So these are severe mental health issues. Just imagine a 12-year-old girl not being able to go to school just because there was a disaster in their area. So yeah, in my country, women are severely impacted and severely affected by climate change on an emotional and on a mental health level.
Now, Porag, you've connected that to climate change, but does the average young woman in Bangladesh connect that to climate change or not?
I think no, not only the average women or young girls. I think most of our the people in our country don't really connect these issues with climate change, because my country is burdened with so many social and economic issues. We don't still see climate change as the umbrella issue of all the issues. But the scenario is changing. People are getting more educated and more aware about climate change.
How about between youth and adults in Bangladeshi society? Is there a big difference, or is it fairly equal in terms of understanding that climate change is a big problem?
Oh, it's a huge difference. I mean, most of our adults don't even believe in climate change. We are quite a religious country, and many people from our previous generations say that the disaster are the wrath of God. I mean, the God is testing us, or the God is giving us these disasters because we did something wrong. They don't still believe in climate change. But on the other hand, young people, they have more access to information, they have more access to knowledge, and there is the internet. So young people know, and young people are more aware of the issue than the elder generations.
Let's go back to COP29 for a moment. After your experience there, Parag, do you feel like the youth voice was represented there?
No. So This is, I think, another global social issue. That's the term I usually use, global social issue, that young people are still not taken seriously, yeah, they will praise us a lot for the works we do on ground, the movements we build, or the actions that we take, but they still don't take us seriously. And when it comes to COP and the global climate decision making processes, yeah, we might be given slots to speak, but when it comes to the actual decision making, our voices and our recommendations aren't exactly reflected there. And the scenario was even worse at COP29, because most of the times we didn't even get a chance to speak or intervene in a negotiation room.
Now, our guest last week, Tenvi, said that it was difficult to be heard when meetings kept being cut short, and she attributed this to the Azerbaijani president. Do you agree with that?
Exactly. This is what happens when you put a oil tycoon as the president of a climate process. You see the conflict of interest, right?
So, the president of Azerbaijan is an oil tycoon?
Yeah, one of the biggest businessmen of the country, and his entire business is oil. As you may know, Azerbaijan is super loaded with oil, and Azerbaijan is one of the very first countries to actually start selling fossil fuel on a commercial level or on a business level. And the president, oh my god, the guy is super rich, super dripped in oil, and that guy was the president of COP29.
So, you feel that he was personally trying to interfere with the youth voice getting that message across?
Yeah, absolutely. Because there were more than 1,770 oil lobbyists at COP. Just imagine
Wow.
having almost 2,000 oil lobbyists in a space where we're actively fighting against them. And these oil lobbyists had access to negotiation rooms, had access to closed door meetings. You can understand what purpose they were there to serve and what purpose the presidency was serving.
So, I understand that you feel that there was not a lot of progress made, but was there some progress made there?
No, I think COP29 took us a bit back, because, as you may know, COP29 was being called as the finance COP. The global vision was to bring out a new financial mechanism that would support countries like mine to progress our climate actions and to progress our national commitments to prevent climate change and the climate crisis in our countries, right? And I mean, the global demand was $5 trillion up until 2035. And guess what they settled on? They settled on a mere $300 billion. That's like 5% of what we asked. With this new finance mechanism and no progress, no visible progress on the loss and damage mechanism, COP29 just took us back a few steps, and there is no substantive progress that we can look up to and that we can rely on, that yeah, this progress or this new decision will at least support us in accelerating our climate action.
So clearly, that's going to be a lot of the global north countries coming to that kind of agreement. I wonder, Porag, how do you feel about the global north in terms of climate change when clearly we have been producing greenhouse gases for a long time and you are feeling the effects of that? Do you have a strong feeling about that?
This is something I have been saying from the very beginning of COP29, that having 29 COPs is the failure of COPs. We don't need 29 years to reach a common consensus that, yeah, we are dying, we are drowning, and we need to take action now to save ourselves. And this is taking 29 years just because the global north countries are blocking it. They very well know what they have done in the past. I mean, what their historical pollutions are and what they owe to people, where their accountabilities lie, but they just choose to ignore it just because they can, and just because no one can say anything to them. So yeah, global north countries have not been acting how they should act.
If you could give us one piece of advice, you're speaking to North Americans on this program, what would that advice be?
Thank you. I think this is a very wonderful space to say this, and I think this message, I'll not give this message to the North American governments, but rather I'd give this message to the people. Governments might be corrupt, but a country's population cannot be corrupt, and I think we, who are the common people, who we hold a higher moral ground than our governments. So what we really need now is that you people pushing your governments to channel better climate finance to the damaged countries or to the global south countries, because it's really important that the public create strong demand of the things that are actually right, that are actually justified to their government, so that the governments are actually forced to do what's right, because we cannot force them, you can.
Porag, as you consider what has been accomplished or not accomplished in the past 29 COPs, is it something we should keep doing?
I think no. I think COP has become a dead process. I'll be very honest with you, because as you may know, COP runs on a consensus-based decision-making system, and even if one country disagrees with a decision, that decision is dead. I think that's a very flawed process. I have been following global stock tech negotiations. What GST is a guiding document for the other mechanisms or other work programs under COP and under the Paris Agreement. So there was this decision making happening on inclusion, and there was this talks about engaging non-state actors as active stakeholders in the decision making process. Most of the countries agreed, one country didn't agree. That's why it did not make it to a decision. This is not the first time this has happened. This has been happening for the past 29 years. So I think the COP process should stop. I mean, yeah, there should be one more COP, the next year's COP. I mean, the Brazil's COP. We are really looking forward to that, because Brazil is also severely hit by the climate crisis, and we expect a lot from Brazil. So let's see, if the Brazil COP is a success, we can rethink about the entire process. But if it's a failure, COP processes should just stop, and there should be new, faster, and more effective process that can take us to what we want. 29 years, 30 years is just too long of a time to come to a decision.
Right. But if we take COP away, what would replace it? Who would replace it? Is it going to be a United Nations responsibility? I mean, who's going to do something about it?
This can be a UN responsibility, but the mechanism has to change. Either it has to be a supermajority or a majority based process, because one country should not be blocking the demands of 194 countries, you know?
When you went home from COP29, is there anything you took from that, even though there were some disappointments? Did it change anything in you and how you deal with life in Bangladesh?
Yeah, and this is the thing, this is the progress I was talking about. COP29 was the first COP when group of countries actually spoke up directly against the injustice they have been facing. I don't know if you've seen the news, but it was all over the news that many countries are walking out of the negotiation rooms, and many countries openly saying that they reject the decision. And this is the first time such thing has happened, and I think the countries are finally starting to take a stand. As an activist, I think diplomacy is a very slow process, and seeing these countries finally standing up and finally calling out these blockers, and I think that's really inspiring, and that's another thing that inspired me at COP, and that's something I have taken from COP29 back to my country, that no matter how powerful the opponent is, and no matter how much money they hold, if it's wrong, it's wrong. And if there's something that's wrong, that's just wrong. And we don't need to live with that wrongdoing just because they are more powerful than us.
Before we wrap up today, Parag, I really want you to be able to share what you're doing with your organization, Youth for NDCs, at home there. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Oh yeah. So a bit of background. NDC is the nationally determined contributions process, right? So NDC is a country's commitment towards achieving the global climate goal from Paris Agreement, which is keeping the global temperature rise around 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030. What Youth for NDCs does is that we engage young people from the country in this national process in a more informed and updated manner. So another background is, my country also has an NDC, but the issue is my country doesn't mention children or youth for even once. And NDCs are seen as the mother documents of the climate process, because NDCs guide all the other processes like adaptation, mitigation, finance, everything. So my country did not include children and youth in this mother document process, and you cannot ensure climate justice by leaving us out, right? So what we do is we train a lot of young people, and we inform them about NDCs and their roles in NDCs, because NDCs are a bit technical, as these are policy documents, they are a bit technical, so it's a bit hard to understand. So what user NDC does is we simplify the NDCs, we localize the contents, and then we do a lot of capacity building, we do a lot of reviews, a lot of consultations, because NDCs we believe should be a public document. and the common people of a country should be able to connect with a document that directly affects their life. So that's what we do. We bridge the gap between the national process and the common people.
Yeah, all the best as you go forward with that.
Thank you.
Now, Parag, you've done a lot of action your whole life. You're an activist about the climate, but have you picked a small climate action for us today that you could share with us?
This might be a contradictory given the work I do. So I need to fly a lot because I oftentimes need to attend different things. So flying leaves a very large carbon footprint, right? So what I do to reduce my carbon footprint or stay a bit more climate positive is that I don't use any fossil fuel driven vehicles when I'm in the country. I try to ignore as many fossil fuel driven vehicles as possible. So in order to avoid those, what I tend to do is I usually walk when it's a shorter distance, and if it's a bit longer distance, I use rickshaw. This is a rickshaw, and this is a paddle driven vehicle, and this does not do any carbon emissions. So this is a way I tend to reduce my carbon footprint, and this is my personal climate action.
Oh, that's great. Sometimes I've heard that rickshaw drivers can be abused in some ways. Is that true, or do they get some fair payment for doing what they do?
There is good and bad in everything, right? So yeah, so it really depends on the passengers. Most of the times it's good passengers, and the rickshaw drivers get a fair wage or payment for the work they do.
So basically, Parag, you're saying that rickshaws are like taxis, except no carbon footprint, right?
Yeah.
And are they readily available? Are they lined up like our taxis are?
Oh, rickshaws are super available. If I go out on the street right now, I'll see at least 10 to 15 rickshaws standing. An interesting and also a very sad fact, the reason behind such availability of rickshaws is that many of the rickshaw pullers are climate migrants. So what happens is that they are usually hit by a climate induced disaster and they lose their livelihood in their villages. So they tend to come to the capital city in search for livelihoods, and many of them end up being rickshaw pullers. I won't say it's enough ways to have a good life, but yeah, they also earn hand to mouth and they go by. It's at least better than living in their villages where they were hit by a climate induced disaster and they practically lost everything on
Right.
their livelihood.
And just to remind those of us who are listening in from North America, what would an average rickshaw driver make in one day? Let's use American dollars since that's common between us.
So on a good day, a rickshaw driver usually makes from 15 to $20, I would say. Only if they have a very good day, they get a lot of passengers and pull the rickshaw for, let's say, around 12 to 14 hours.
Wow. Now, Porag, before we let you go, we need to ask you one final question. What gives you hope?
Oh, this is actually quite a difficult question because after COP29, hope has become a bit difficult word because, like I mentioned earlier, that we are literally going back in the process. We're taking back steps. But one thing that really gives me hope is seeing that a lot of young people feel like me and they think like me. This is something that always also inspires me, that whenever I remember I'm not alone in this fight and I can find more people, many more people will hold my hand if I fail or if I fall down. I think that gives me hope. I think in one sentence, young people give me hope because one thing about me and the people I work with is that we are radically positive and we know that we can bring the change and we know that we can take care of the world. So yeah, that gives me hope. Young people give me hope.
Well, Porag, you are passionate, clearly. You're an activist. And I love what you said because you actually give me hope. And I think sometimes it's easy to get down, and hearing your stories and what you're doing, I think will give our listeners and our viewers great hope too. We thank you so much for sharing your perspective. It's so different than ours here in North America. And we just so much appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you, John, for creating this platform, where people like me can share our thoughts. And I think it's really refreshing and really helpful for me as well to be able to speak in that manner and to be able to openly share what has happened and how we feel about it. So thank you for creating this platform.
And thank you, dear listener. We will be back again next Tuesday with another young person who has experienced COP29. Don't miss out on that climate action figure. And until then...
I actually forgot what I was supposed to say. Sorry.
Until then...
Go figures.
This has been Climate Action Figures. Our show is produced and hosted by John Whidden. Our creative consultant is Kayla McIntosh. Our theme song is Hawaii Vacation by Tavari. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at Climate Action Figures. That's all one word. And if you have any other questions or comments that arose from this or any episode, feel free to reach out to us at climateactionfigures@gmail.com. And thank you for listening. We'll be back next week with another Climate Action Figure.